I think I just broke my Korean husband with a pot of rice. My name is Adaeze. I am from Enugu State, Nigeria. I have been married to Jae-won, a man from Busan, South Korea, for 3 years. And in those 3 years, I have cooked him jerk chicken, I have introduced him to egusi soup, I have watched him bravely swallow a piece of oaf akwu and smile at me with tears in his eyes. But I had never, not once, cooked him jollof rice. Not because I was afraid. Not because I thought he couldn't handle it. But because jollof rice, in my family, is not just food. It is a test. And I wasn't sure Jae-won was ready to be tested. Until this Sunday, when everything changed. He had been telling his Korean friends for weeks that his wife's Nigerian cooking was not that spicy. But he had never tasted the dish that Nigerian mothers cook for celebrations, for funerals, for weddings, for moments when words are not enough. Therefore, on a quiet Sunday morning, I decided to cook the most important pot of rice I had ever made in my life, and I invited his mother to watch. His mother had flown in from Busan specifically for this weekend. She did not know what jollof was. She had never tasted anything from West Africa. And she had, I found out later, Googled Nigerian spicy food the night before and quietly packed antacids in her handbag. Stay with me. Because what she did at the 18-minute mark of this video is something I will never forget as long as I live. Before I show you what happened at the table, I need to tell you about the pepper. My mother called me on Saturday night, the night before I cooked, and she asked me one question. Not, how is your husband? Not, how is the weather in Lagos? She asked, Adaeze, are you putting the right pepper? In my family, jollof rice has a specific pepper blend. It is not just Scotch bonnet. It is not just tat ash. There is a third pepper, a small, wrinkled, almost dried pepper that my grandmother brought from the village, the name of which I will not spell correctly because I only ever learned it by ear, and this pepper does something to the back of your throat that no other chili on earth does. It does not burn immediately. It waits. It lets you think you are safe. And then, approximately 45 seconds after the first bite, it introduces itself. My grandmother called it the polite pepper. It greets you. Then it moves in permanently. I told my mother yes. I was putting the right pepper. She said, double it. I had cooked jollof before with the standard amount and Jae-won had eaten it fine. But this was not a standard occasion. His mother was here. My pride was involved. And my mother, the woman who taught me to cook, was on the phone telling me to double the most aggressive ingredient in the pot. Therefore, I doubled it. And I am still not sure to this day whether that was the bravest or the most reckless decision of my marriage. Now, here is what you need to understand about Jae-won before we go any further, because this is important context for everything that happens later. Jae-won grew up in Busan. If you know anything about South Korean food culture, you know that Busan is a port city, and the people of Busan are proud of their food in the way that Nigerians are proud of theirs. He has eaten tteokbokki, the rice cakes in fiery red sauce, since he was a child. He eats kimchi the way I eat garden eggs. He is not a man who is afraid of heat. In fact, on the morning I made the jollof, he sat across from me at the kitchen counter, drinking his coffee, watching me blend the peppers, and said 4 words that I will never let him forget. He looked at the blender. He looked at me. He sipped his coffee. And he said, that doesn't look spicy. Those 4 words. That is the sentence that started everything. Because he said them in front of his mother. Let me walk you through how I made this pot, because the technique matters, and because understanding the process is the only way you will fully appreciate what Jae-won went through at the table. Authentic Nigerian Party Jollof rice is not a quick dish. It is not something you decide to make at noon and serve at 2. It is a commitment. It is a negotiation between fire and time. The smoke is not an accident. It is the goal. In Nigeria, we call the bottom of a well-made pot of jollof the bottom pot, and that slightly smoky, caramelized, almost burnt layer at the base is the most fought-over part of the meal. My grandmother used to scrape the bottom pot into a separate bowl and eat it alone, at the sink, before anyone could ask for it. I started the process at 7 in the morning. I blended the Scotch bonnets, the tat ash peppers, the tomatoes, the onions, and, yes, double the grandmother pepper, all together until they were smooth. I fried the blended pepper in hot oil for nearly 40 minutes, until the raw tomato smell cooked out and what remained was a deep, red-orange, concentrated paste that smelled like something between a stew and a warning. But the paste looked darker than I expected. More aggressive. My mother-in-law walked into the kitchen at this exact moment, took one look at the pot, and walked back out without saying a word. Therefore, I knew we were on the right track. I want to pause here and tell you something that nobody talks about when they explain Nigerian jollof. The smell changes. When you first fry the pepper, it smells aggressive, sharp, peppery, almost acidic. But around the 40-minute mark, when the oil separates from the tomato and floats to the top in a thin, gleaming layer, and you see the paste start to darken and thicken at the edges of the pot, that is when the smell transforms. It becomes something warm. Something that makes people walk toward your kitchen instead of away from it. I watched Jae-won, from the corner of my eye, get up from the sofa. He walked to the kitchen doorway. He stood there for about 10 seconds. He did not say anything. He just inhaled. Then he went back to his sofa. Then he came back 2 minutes later. He stood in the doorway again, and this time he said, "Adaeze, what is that smell?" Not in a bad way. In the way you ask about something that is pulling you somewhere before your brain has decided whether to follow. That question told me everything I needed to know. The pepper had done its first job. It had seduced him. What it would do next, that was the part one was still nervous about. I added the washed parboiled rice to the pot at around 10 in the morning. The ratio of rice to pepper base is everything. Too much rice and the flavor becomes thin, pale, almost apologetic. Too little and the pepper overwhelms the starch and you end up with a paste. This balance is something my mother never wrote down. She never measured. She taught me by watching and by intuition, by the color of the pot, by the way the steam smelled, by a sound the rice makes when it starts to absorb the base correctly. I covered the pot. I turned the heat to medium-low. I set a timer. The rice needed to steam undisturbed for 30 minutes. If I lifted the lid too early, the steam would escape and the rice would cook unevenly, crunchy at the bottom, soft at the top. But Jae-won's mother knocked on the kitchen door at the 22-minute mark and asked, in Korean, which Jae-won translated, whether she could just peek. Therefore, I had to stand in the doorway with my arms slightly out, like a goalkeeper, and explain, through my husband to my mother-in-law, in a language I do not speak, that peeking was not allowed. Not now. Not ever. Not in a Nigerian kitchen during jollof. She stared at me for a moment. Then she nodded very slowly, the way someone nods when they are not fully convinced but are choosing to respect the rules of a foreign country. Jae-won started laughing. I shot him a look. He stopped laughing. What none of us knew, what I didn't even realize until much later, was that while she was waiting outside that kitchen, his mother had been texting her friends in Busan. In real time. About my cooking. I only found out what she was saying when Jae-won translated the messages for me, 2 days later, after everything had happened. What she wrote. I want you to stay to the end of this video, because I am going to read you those messages exactly as she wrote them. By 12:30, the kitchen smelled like a party. It smelled like every birthday I had in Enugu growing up. It smelled like my grandmother's kitchen on a Saturday, with aunties talking loudly over each other and children being shooed outside and a pot on the stove that everyone kept walking past just to smell it again. I uncovered the pot for the first time and tasted a single grain of rice. It was perfect. The rice was cooked all the way through, each grain separate, not clumped, fully saturated with the pepper base. The color was that deep, burnt orange red that tells you the smoky bottom is forming. I scraped a small section at the base with a wooden spoon and confirmed it. The bottom pot was there, dark and fragrant and exactly the way my mother makes it. In that moment, I felt something I can only describe as ancestral satisfaction. Like my grandmother, somewhere, approved. I set the table. I called Jae-won and his mother from the living room. I plated the rice, generous, steaming, the color of sunset, and placed a piece of fried chicken beside it. I put a bottle of cold water within easy reach. I sat down across from them both. Jae-won looked at his plate. He picked up his fork. He took a small grain of rice from the edge of the plate, just the edge where the pepper is lightest, and he said, with a confidence that I found both admirable and concerning, "This looks good. I think I can handle this." He had not yet reached the middle of the plate. But the middle of the plate, and especially the small scoop I had placed there from near the bottom of the pot, dense with reduced pepper and carrying the full weight of my grandmother's doubled secret ingredient, was where the real jollof lived. Therefore, I said nothing. I folded my hands in my lap. I smiled at him in the way that, if you are married, you know this smile. It is the smile of someone who is aware of information that you are not yet aware of. He took the first proper forkful. Rice from the center of the plate. A good, solid bite. He chewed. He nodded. "This is good," he said. "It's smoky. I can taste the tomato. There's depth here." He stopped talking. He blinked. "That is the grandmother pepper. That is it arriving." Not a scream of heat. A knock. A polite, firm knock at the back of the throat that says, "Hello. I am here now. And I will be here for a while." Jae-won set his fork down. Not dramatically. Carefully. The way you set something down when you need both hands free to think. And what he said next. I need you to see his face when he says it. It is at the 13-minute mark of this video, and I have never loved him more than in that exact moment. He looked at me. His eyes were bright, not watering yet, but bright in the way that eyes get when the body is deciding how to respond to something unexpected. He said, "Ada, this is different." Not, "It's too spicy." Not, "I can't handle it." Different. I said, "Different how?" He picked up his fork again, which told me everything, and took another bite. Smaller this time. More deliberate. Slower. The way you eat something that is demanding your full attention. "It's like the spice is underneath the flavor," he said. With tteokbokki, the heat is the first thing. It announces itself. But this lets you taste the rice first. The smokiness. The tomato. And then the heat comes after, like it was waiting for you to love the food before it showed you what it could really do. I put my fork down. I stared at my husband. He had just described Nigerian Jollof rice better than I have ever heard it described in my entire life. And he had done it on his first bite. I need to pause here for one moment to tell you what was happening on the other side of the table, because his mother's reaction was a completely separate story running simultaneously, and in some ways it is the story I want to tell even more. She had watched Jae-won's face during his first bite. She had seen him stop talking. She had seen him set his fork down. And so she had taken a much smaller first bite than he did, a cautious, almost scientific portion, and she was now sitting very still, with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point slightly above the table, in the way that a person sits still when they are having an internal experience that they have not decided how to classify yet. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. I watched her. Jae-won watched her. We did not speak, because you do not interrupt someone while they are meeting jollof for the first time. But then she reached forward, picked up her fork again without looking at it, and scooped a second bite, this time a larger one. Therefore I exhaled. Because when someone who is uncertain about a food takes a larger second bite, that is not uncertainty anymore. That is a decision. You have been waiting for this since I mentioned it in the first 30 seconds. I promised you I would tell you what Jae-won's mother did at the 18-minute mark, and I keep my promises. We had been eating for about 6 minutes. Jae-won was on his third helping. Not a polite refill, a real helping, rice heaped high, the kind of serving that tells a cook that everything they did was right. He had stopped analyzing the flavor and started just eating, which is the highest compliment in any cuisine. His water glass was half empty. His eyes were glistening. He had undone the top button of his shirt. He was sweating in the way that you sweat when the food is worth it. His mother had finished her first plate and had been sitting quietly for a few moments. I thought she was done. I thought she was taking a polite break in the way that people do when they are full but don't want to seem impolite. Then she looked at me. Directly. In the eyes. And she pointed at the pot on the stove. She said one word in Korean. Jae-won looked up from his plate, surprised. He turned to me and translated. She's asking if there's more. Not, may I have more? Not, if it's not too much trouble. She pointed at the pot and said the Korean word for more with the directness of a woman who has decided she wants something and sees no reason to be subtle about it. I want to tell you what happened next. But first, I need to tell you what she said in those texts. 2 days later, Jae-won was scrolling through his phone and started smiling in that particular way. The quiet, private smile. That means he has found something he wants to share with me but is trying to figure out how to present it. He said, "Do you want to know what my mother was texting her friends during the meal?" He showed me the messages. He translated them out loud, phrase by phrase, while I sat next to him on the sofa. The first message, sent at 12:31 p.m., right after her first bite. "The smell in this kitchen is extraordinary. I have been in kitchens all my life. I have never smelled anything like this." The second message, sent at 12:34 p.m. "It is spicy. But the spice is inside the food, not on top of it. I do not know how to explain this." The third message, sent at 12:41 p.m., this is the one that made me stop breathing for a second. "Jae-won's wife cooks the way my mother cooked. I don't mean the same food. I mean the same feeling. I think this is what love tastes like when it comes from somewhere else. I think this is what love tastes like when it comes from somewhere else." I read that message 3 times. Then I asked Jae-won to read it to me again out loud. Then I excused myself, walked to the bathroom, and cried for about 4 minutes. The good kind of crying, the kind where you are not sad at all, you are just overwhelmed by how much the world can hold in a single moment. I had cooked jollof rice because I wanted to share something of myself with the family I had married into. But I had not expected that it would work this deeply, this quickly, in this language of taste and memory and smoke. Therefore, what started as a cooking video became something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Proof that food is not just fuel or flavor, it is a vocabulary that every human being on earth already speaks, no matter where they were born. I want to take a few minutes here, away from the table, away from Jae-won's watering eyes, to tell you what jollof rice actually is, because I think it is impossible to understand the full weight of that afternoon without understanding the full weight of the dish. Jollof rice is not a recipe. It is a position. It is a declaration. It is, depending on which West African country you are from, the centerpiece of your proudest culinary identity. The ongoing and very serious debate between Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal over who makes the best jollof is one of the longest-running cultural arguments on the African continent, and it is conducted with a passion and a specificity that will make you feel, briefly, that geopolitics is simply cooking competition by other means. In Nigeria specifically, and I say this with the calm confidence of a woman who grew up eating it twice a week, Nigerian Party Jollof is considered by most Nigerians to be the pinnacle of the dish. And Party Jollof has one defining characteristic that separates it from every other version. It is cooked over firewood, or over a flame hot enough to mimic firewood, with the deliberate intention of creating smoke. That smoke, trapped under the lid, absorbed into the rice, is what transforms a technically correct pot of seasoned rice into something transcendent. When Jae-won described the smokiness in his first bite, he was tasting something that my great-grandmother would have tasted. He was tasting a thread that runs back through generations of Nigerian women standing over fire. And he tasted it on his first attempt, without context, without instruction, without anything except a fork and an open mind. I've been thinking about what that means ever since. But I want to go even further than the flavor, because there is a conversation that Jae-won and I had later that evening, after his mother had gone to bed, after we had washed the dishes, sitting on our balcony with cold drinks, that I think is the real heart of this whole story. He asked me, "Why did you wait 3 years to cook this for me?" It was a simple question. It was not accusatory. He asked it with genuine curiosity, the way he asks me everything. Directly, without decoration, the way people from Busan apparently communicate, which took me a long time to get used to and which I now love completely. I thought about it for a while before I answered. The honest answer is this. Jollof rice, in my family, is a meal with stakes. It is not the food you cook when you are trying something out. It is not an experiment. My mother cooked it for my father on the day he formally came to ask for her hand. That is a true story. My grandmother cooked it the night before my mother's wedding. I cooked it once, alone, in my first apartment in Lagos, when I got my first proper job, because I needed to mark the occasion with something serious. I had been protecting Jae-won from the weight of the dish, saving it for when it meant something big enough to deserve it. But what I had not realized, what that Sunday afternoon showed me, was that 3 years of a good marriage, and a mother who flew from Busan to visit her son and his Nigerian wife, was exactly the occasion the rice had been waiting for. Therefore, when I told Jae-won why I had waited, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I wrote in my journal that night before I slept. He said, "Then I'm glad you waited. Some things are better when they arrive at the right time." Now, I promised I would come back to something, and I keep my promises. I mentioned early on that Jae-won had told his Korean friends that his wife's Nigerian cooking was not that spicy. The statement that started this whole story. 3 days after the Sunday meal, he had a video call with his friends from university. I was in the next room, folding laundry, half listening the way you half listen when you are not the focus of a conversation but the conversation is about you. I heard him say, in the mix of Korean and English that he uses with his friends, "She cooked jollof rice." Silence from his friends. "Nigerian jollof." More silence and then, "Did you survive?" I heard him laugh. The specific laugh of someone who has earned something. And he said, I put down the laundry to hear this more clearly. "It's not about surviving. That's not the right question." But his friend pushed back. "Then what's the right question?" Therefore, Jae-won said something I did not expect, and something I will close this video with, because I think it is the most complete answer to a question I have been trying to answer since the day I left Nigeria and started building a life somewhere that was not home. His friend asked, "What is the right question?" And Jae-won said, "The right question is, did it make you feel something? Because that's the only reason anyone cooks anything worth eating." I stood in the doorway of the living room, holding a half-folded shirt, and I looked at my husband, this Korean man from Busan who grew up a world away from Enugu, who had sat at my table and been honest about what a forkful of rice made him feel, who had translated his mother's messages about love and what it tastes like when it comes from somewhere else, and I thought about my grandmother. About the bowl of bottom pot she used to carry to the sink. About my mother telling me to double the pepper on the phone the night before. About the whole long chain of women in my family who had stood over a fire and fed people they loved and trusted the food to say what language sometimes cannot. And I thought, yes, this is exactly why I cook this. Not to impress. Not to challenge. Not to prove that Nigerian food is superior to Korean food or anyone else's food. Because that competition, while entertaining to debate on the internet, misses the entire point. I cook it because it is the most honest thing I own. It is the part of myself that requires no translation, no explanation, no apology. The smoke in the pot is a memory. The grandmother pepper is an inheritance. The color of the rice when it is done right is a signal, not to taste buds, but to something older than taste buds. Jae-won's mother called me 2 weeks after she returned to Busan. She called me on my phone, not Jae-won's phone. Mine. She had gotten my number from Jae-won without telling him why. And she asked me, through Jae-won who she had apparently already briefed, for one thing. I want to tell you what she asked for, because this is the ending I did not write and could not have written. She asked for the recipe. Not a restaurant recommendation. Not a YouTube tutorial. She called her son's Nigerian wife and asked for the recipe. Specifically, she asked, "The pepper. The special one. What is it called and where do I find it?" I told Jae-won to tell her that the pepper does not have a name that translates easily, and that I would have to send her some from Nigeria. But then I thought about my mother's voice on the phone that Saturday night, telling me to double it. Therefore, I called my mother before I sent anything, and I told her what had happened. The meal, the texts, the phone call, all of it. And she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, in Igbo, "That is how food is supposed to work." I sent Jae-won's mother a small package. Inside, a sealed bag of the grandmother pepper, a handwritten note with quantities. Not a recipe, because jollof cannot be a recipe, but approximate quantities, and a short message in English that said, "It is called the polite pepper. It greets you. Then it stays." She texted back 3 days later. One sentence. Jae-won translated it over breakfast. I understand now why my son married her. I understand now why my son married her. I have been making videos on this channel for a while now. I have talked about culture shock, about the loneliness of building a life in a country where everything is familiar to your husband and nothing is familiar to you. I have talked about the small indignities and the occasional large joys of being a Nigerian woman married into a Korean family, trying to hold both of those identities without dropping either one. But I have never felt, until that Sunday afternoon, that I had actually managed to build a bridge. Not through conversation. Not through explanation. Through a pot on a stove, and smoke, and a grandmother's pepper that waits for you to love the food before it shows you what it can do. That bridge was made of jollof rice. And it crossed something I didn't fully know was a distance until it wasn't one anymore. If you have a dish like this, a dish from your family, your grandmother, your village, the place you come from before you came to wherever you are now, I want you to think about who has not yet tasted it. Not because they don't deserve it, but because you have been protecting it, the way I protected mine. Waiting for the right moment. I am telling you now, the right moment is the next time you are with someone you love. Cook it. Put the grandmother pepper in. Double it if you have to. Trust the smoke. Trust the bottom pot. Trust the food to say what you cannot always find the words to say. It will speak. It always does. If this video meant something to you, if it reminded you of a dish, or a person, or a kitchen that smelled like something you can still feel in your chest, please subscribe. Not because the algorithm needs it, but because I am going to keep cooking these meals, keep telling these stories, and I want you at the table when I do. Next week, Jae-won attempts to cook bibimbap for my mother, who has never eaten Korean food in her life, and who told me on the phone last Tuesday, and I am quoting directly, "If there is no rice and stew, I do not consider it a meal." He has a week to prepare. I have already warned him. I will see you then. Cook it for someone. Trust the smoke. The food will say the rest.